It's almost a cliche to point out the mosquitoes have killed more humans than any other animal. When I say more people, I mean far more. A total of 100,000 people were killed by snakes in 2022. For dogs, it was 30,000. Crocodiles, a mere 1,000. For mosquitoes, it was 1,000,000. Even the numbers of humans killed by humans is eclipsed by the number of humans killed by these tiny insects. And keep in mind that only a quarter of mosquito species drink blood, and only the females of those species bite us. The males live a more peaceful life of mating and eating nectar. A life of sex and sugar couldn't get any better. Wherever there was still water and enough heat and humidity, there were plenty of mosquitoes, which led to the deaths of millions of humans and changed the course of human history multiple times. Mosquitoes trace their origin long before human history and long before humans ever existed to begin with. These vile creatures, the ones that suck your blood at least, trace their origins to the days of the dinosaurs, when they were sucking the blood and spreading diseases that led to the reduction of various dinosaur species long before the meteorite hit the Earth. This is where the inspiration of Jurassic Park comes from. Granted, the mosquitoes shown in the movie weren't the mosquitoes that actually suck blood. Certain mosquitoes would evolve to hunt and infect various other creatures such as reptiles and an emerging group of creatures known as birds and mammals. Some even go after fish out of the water like mud skippers. Fast forward 75 million years later, and humans would emerge on the savannas of East Africa, a region that would become drier and didn't maintain that much water unless it was the wet season. There was still a relatively good amount of still fresh water along the great African lakes, as well as watering holes and other bodies of water for the mosquitoes to lay their larvae on. It's worth noting that it isn't the mosquito in and of itself that kills organisms, but rather the pathogens carried by the mosquitoes, namely viruses such as the ones that cause yellow fever and dengue fever and Zika. However, the most notable of all mosquito-borne illnesses, the most deadly in terms of raw numbers by far, is malaria, which is caused by a protist. A protist is a single-celled organism that, unlike bacteria, has a nucleus. Mosquitoes can also carry roundworms, a lovely combination that can cause elephantitis, which thickens the skin and overrides lymph nodes, resulting in images like this one. Now sure, mosquitoes were not the only creatures to hunt humans during the early days. Lions, leopards, crocodiles, and hippos would also kill us, but nowhere near as effectively as these tiny little bugs. Mosquitoes were able to do this by using a numbing agent during their bites, in which the victims can't tell when they're being bitten until after they've gotten your blood. Today, in most developed nations, this results in a nuisance. But for pre-modern people, and many people today in the poorest countries of the world, it could still be a death sentence. To make matters worse, mosquitoes tend to prefer a common type of blood, namely type O. People with high body heat as well tend to attract a lot of mosquitoes, and pregnant women in particular are also favored. Even drinking alcohol makes you more susceptible as it increases your body temperature, and that probably explains why I get bitten so much. To this day, sub-Saharan Africa, with its humid, warm climate and low levels of development, is the most heavily hit by mosquito-borne illnesses. And to this day, people in sub-Saharan Africa and their diaspora have higher likelihoods of developing what is called sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease turns your red blood cells into sickle-like shapes. And this is debilitating, but it does prevent the protist that causes malaria from killing the host. As a result, this inherited disorder is more common among people of recent African origin, and it still harms many African Americans to this day, despite living in regions where malaria is no longer a significant threat. Humans would eventually migrate out of Africa, and would encounter mosquitoes almost everywhere they went, unless it was in the absolute most cold or most arid places. In other words, anywhere where humans could really live comfortably. Many mosquito species are crepuscular, meaning that they are awake during the dawn and dusk. This is when mosquito bites tend to be the most common, and it also tends to be the time of day/night that are best for farming. Humans tended to farm during dawn and dusk as the weather was not as hot during that time, and on top of that, there was at least enough light to see what you were doing, making these people very prone to mosquito bites. Most early human civilizations sprung around river valleys, and while the flowing water of rivers were not conducive for mosquitoes, which tend to lay eggs in still water, these humans still did use irrigation to water their crops, which oftentimes resulted in still water that was perfect for mosquitoes, and as a result, many mosquitoes proliferated and killed many people. This was most likely seen along rice paddies and grain fields. The flooding of the Nile seasonally led to an explosion of mosquito populations once a year, and this ended up clamping down on human population growth for their civilization. During the classical period, one group of people called the Latins settled around a group of hills in a series of settlements that became the city of Rome. Rome managed to escape the horrors of malaria on the top of drier hills and the rushing waters of the Tiber River. However, along the southern edge of Rome are the Pontine Marshes, an area of wetlands that acted as a biological buffer between Rome and the world they conquered. The still waters of these marshes were a paradise for mosquitoes and acted as a wall which impeded enemy invasions. The largest of these invasions was done by Rome's rival Carthage. The brilliant military mind, Hannibal of Carthage, crushed much of Rome's resistance around the Italian peninsula. However, his army contracted malaria, and he ended up losing his right eye due to the infection. Had it not been for malaria, it would have been very likely that Carthage would have won, and for better or for worse, this would have had a profound impact on human history given how influential the Romans were. When Germanic barbarians invaded the Italian peninsula as the Western Roman Empire was collapsing, mosquitoes ended up becoming a more formidable opponent of the barbarians than the Romans. The marshes were in large part kept intact due to their utility. However, this would change during the 20th century, when the fascist dictator Mussolini drained the marshes, resulting in a massive reduction of malaria in central Italy. However, during World War II, when the Allies had conquered the ruins of Carthage and Tunisia, and then hopped onto Sicily and then mainland Italy, the Italians surrendered, only to be taken over by their former allies, the Germans, who had flooded the marshes again as a form of biological warfare against the Allies, as malaria ravaged American and Canadian troops during the Italian campaign. Speaking of American troops, part of the reason why the British General Cornelius surrendered to the Americans, losing the Revolutionary War, was because his forces were heavily hit by malaria, far more so than the rebels. Until relatively recently, malaria was a major killer in the southern United States, largely due to the swamps and marshes of the region. With widespread medication and the drainage of wetlands, the mosquito population declined drastically in the United States, resulting in states like Florida, which barely had any people, having population booms. A similar story had played out in other human parts of the developed world, with simple measures like screen windows, mosquito nets, as well as stormwater management. The widespread use of scientific medicine and other factors led to the decline of malaria, and populated centers sprouting up around freshwater still bodies. Africa was the last part of the world to be colonized by Europeans, as they would oftentimes die whenever they traveled into the African interior due to malaria. However, they would use tonic water, which is a carbonated liquid with quinine dissolved in it. Europeans could inculcate themselves against malaria infections using this beverage. And it was oftentimes mixed with gin, and it became a favorite drink. The developing world has not been quite as lucky though, as many of them live in the tropics and subtropics where the heat and humidity is more intense. And they also have poorer access to medicine, and their populations are oftentimes more dependent on farming in rural areas, and as a result of this, there have been more deaths. Latin America, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia are mildly affected, certainly far less than sub-Saharan Africa. During the 2010s, however, Zika broke out in Central America, which caused birth defects. This is also one of the few mosquito-borne illnesses that can also be an STI. Thankfully, many of the same tactics used in the developed world have worked in the developing world. Mosquito nets, mosquito coils, and screens are insanely cheap and effective measures. Vaccines for viral-based diseases like yellow fever have become very popular. However, malaria is born about by a protist rather than a virus, and vaccines just aren't as well suited for protozoa, especially given how fast the mutations are. And it's very difficult for scientists to keep track of malaria for this reason. As a result, malaria is usually prevented with malaria pills rather than a vaccine. When I went to Africa, I had to take a few malaria pills a few days before I arrived, during my trip, and a week after I left. Now, there is also the West Nile virus, which is known to infect large swaths of the developed world, albeit at a far less deadly fashion. There is also dengue fever, which is caused by a virus, and mostly affects Latin America and Southeast Asia, but is usually ignored. Some measures have backfired as well. Bug spraying has oftentimes killed weak mosquitoes, resulting in stronger ones surviving and spreading their genes. Due to the mass destruction and death that these creatures have caused, there is talk about wiping them out for good. The usual argument against this is that mosquitoes provide food in the food chain that basically prop up the entire ecosystem. However, the journal Nature had an article which states that there are plenty of other insects that can easily provide a food source in replacement for mosquitoes. Insects that usually don't result in the deaths of millions upon millions of humans. There has also been talk of a gene drive used to kill off mosquito populations that drink blood. This is done by genetically modifying mosquitoes to propagate certain alleles throughout populations with a probability higher than 50. One gene is known as NIX, located on the male mosquito's Y chromosome, which is responsible for making them male. This is a gross oversimplification, but bear with me. Anyway, scientists can insert the NIX gene into females. This will turn the females into fertile males, which can breed with females and spread the gene, thus creating more and more males over several generations that can't reproduce anymore, and by a certain point, you'll pretty much just have males. It'll be a sausage fest, and they don't even bite anyway, and then they'll just die out. Other researchers release sterile mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes breed with them, but they don't have any offspring. This could revolutionize medical technology, and could save millions upon millions of lives. But also keep in mind that it is playing with nature. And as dark as it sounds, many have pointed out that mosquitoes are a way of controlling human populations from getting too high. As crass as it sounds, there is an element of truth to this. As chilling of a thought as it is, they have controlled us far better than we have controlled them.